Good afternoon and welcome. My name is David Hayes. I'm the Executive Director of the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center at NYU School of Law. For the past year and a half, the State Impact Center has had the privilege of working with a number of state attorneys general who are leading the charge against the Trump administration's many assaults on clean air, clean water, clean energy, and climate change. I'm honored to have with me today 4 of the leaders of this impressive cohort of state attorneys general. I will introduce them and turn this program over to them shortly. But first, I want to offer a brief frame for today's press conference. As you know, the progressive state attorney general community has had a remarkable string of successes in blunting the first wave of administration attempts to delay or otherwise refuse to implement environmental protections that were put in place by the previous administration. The Institute for Policy Integrity at NYU, our sister center at NYU, has noted that the government has lost 90% of the deregulation cases that have been decided by the courts to date. So kudos to today's speakers for their performance in resisting rollbacks to date. Despite its poor track record, however, the Trump administration is not giving up. Far from it. This afternoon, the State Impact Center is releasing a special report entitled Climate and Health Showdown in the Courts, State Attorneys General Prepared to Fight. Our special report focuses on the administration's second wave strategy to finalize its own set of new rules that, if they survive judicial review, will nullify the progress made by the prior administration in requiring major sources of greenhouse gases to implement common sense, cost-effective controls on those emissions, as required by the Clean Air Act and as confirmed by the Supreme Court in Massachusetts v. EPA, a case brought by General Healey's predecessor. The story told in the special report is that these rollbacks would provide a virtually across-the-board, never mind, pass on pollution controls for 4 of the largest emission sectors in the United States: the oil and gas industry, the coal industry, the automotive industry, and the waste industry. Indeed, the 6 rules reviewed and detailed in the report account for nearly half of all greenhouse gases released from all sources in the U.S. In other words, if the administration is successful, our nation will have lost its most important near-term opportunity to start reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as we know we must and as the law requires us to do. As explained in the special report, by 2025, if the administration has its way, we can expect more than 200 million metric tons of totally avoidable carbon dioxide equivalent pollution to be emitted from these sectors each and every year. This represents carbon pollution associated with more than 44 million cars on the road for a year, 1.1 million rail cars worth of coal burned, or 23 billion gallons of gasoline consumed each and every year. In addition, these rollbacks would bring with them increased levels of conventional pollutants, leading to literally thousands more premature deaths, hundreds of thousands more asthma attacks, and countless additional missed school and work days. It's all detailed in the special report using the administration's own data. And it deserves to be emphasized that these adverse health effects put our most vulnerable Americans, including our children, the elderly, and the economically disadvantaged, directly in harm's way. We all should know that this is not the time to pretend that climate change is not a threat and to have our government ignore its legal obligations to reduce the emissions that are causing it. It's particularly galling for these state attorneys general in states that are working hard to reduce climate pollution to have the federal government working at cross purposes against their state-based efforts to reduce fossil fuel-based climate pollution by saving energy, accelerating the transition to electric vehicles, and bringing more clean and renewable energy, clean energy online. The state of California has a special beef in this regard, given the unique statutory rights that it has to establish stricter fuel economy standards to address pollution in its state, and by extension, in the 4 states represented here. As you know, the administration is not only rolling back previously agreed to reductions in car and light truck emissions, but it has proposed to Bigfoot California's rights under the Clean Air Act. I'm channeling General Becerra here, who regretfully was not able to travel to Washington for this announcement, by saying that California will not let this happen. Which brings me to today's panel. 4 leading state attorneys general who are the first line of defense against the administration's effort to make the nation safe for climate pollution and the other dangerous pollutants that come with it. I'd now like to introduce the 4 state attorney generals who are on the stage with you today. They will each offer a few opening remarks, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So let me go right down the line, and first introduce Attorney General Brian Frosh of Maryland for a few comments.
Thank you, David, and thank you very much for your good work and the Impact Center's good work on climate change in general and on protecting our environment. You know, Donald Trump ran for president saying he was going to be a change agent. And unfortunately, he has. He has become an agent of climate change. This series of actions that you've described are extraordinarily troubling. They will, as the report points out, lead to 200 million metric tons of additional climate pollution, CO2 pollution. That's more than 440 billion pounds of CO2 that will go into our atmosphere as a result of the changes that Donald Trump is proposing to make to the regulations governing these emissions. He has targeted fossil fuels not to decrease their emissions or their threat to society, but to increase their emissions. It's extraordinarily dangerous. Besides the devastating climate impact that these regulation changes would have, as David mentioned, it will be harmful to those of us who live in the United States. The pollution levels of nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, and volatile organic compounds will increase dramatically, or will be higher dramatically than they would be without these changes. And that will cause disease and death for hundreds of thousands of Americans. In the face of what are obvious signs of climate change, this is outrageous. I mean, we have experienced extraordinary tornadoes this week, flooding that's unprecedented throughout our country, hurricanes that have been repetitive and unprecedented in their force throughout our nation. We're watching this with our own eyes, and it's just dangerous and reckless to say what we need is hair of the dog. We need more of this. We need more pollution. We need to burn more fossil fuels. You know, the president tries to cast this as an ideological war, a war between liberals and conservatives, and it's not. It's a war between fact and fiction. It's a war between science and magical thinking. And it's a war that we must win to protect ourselves and our planet. I'm especially proud to be here with Attorneys General Healy, James, and Tong. And I don't know whether I pass the baton or you do, but I'm glad to be here with these guys. Great. They're true fighters.
I want to first mention that General Frosh has been a huge leader in the group of attorneys general, in particular on the offshore drilling issues that are very current here. And through his office, he has led the group of attorneys general who have been fighting against the proposed seismic testing and also, of course, the potential for oil production off the East Coast. So we thank you for that. And now I'd like to introduce Maura Healey, the Attorney General of Massachusetts, who's been an enormous force on these climate change issues and others throughout, in the long line of Massachusetts leadership in this area. I mentioned the case of Massachusetts versus EPA, which established that the Clean Air Act does cover greenhouse gases as air pollutants. So I turn it over to General Healey for her comments.
Thank you, David, and thank you to all at the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center. a group formed just a brief couple of years ago, and I think today's report is significant. This shows work getting done. We knew with the election of Donald Trump that there were going to be any number of problems and issues. There was going to be a lack of enforcement, an abdication of responsibility when it comes to enforcing laws that are there to protect our air, our water, our soil. We also knew, and sadly what we have seen, is that the departments that are in charge of these areas are increasingly and really solely run by proponents of and former executives of the fossil fuel industry. So as a result, we have seen as states a terrific need to both pick up the enforcement work, and we thank the center for its contribution, but also we keep having to fight regularly in court against efforts to roll back important standards and limits that were put in place. This is a strong coalition of state attorneys general offices. I am very proud to be with my colleagues here today and to work with other colleagues who are not here today, and we are proud to work with the center. And we will continue to fight. Not only is this a coalition that is strong, it's a coalition that is winning. And I think if you look at this report, you will see the fruits of the intensity and the energy of that labor. And we do this because it is so imperative. David mentioned it was years ago that Massachusetts joined with other states in suing the EPA to get the EPA to do its job. The win in the Supreme Court resulted in a couple of things. One, the EPA having to begin to address climate change, and two, the institution of programs and policies in states around the country and at the federal level that led the groundwork for a clean energy economy. In Massachusetts, for example, today alone, we have a clean energy economy that is $11 billion strong and growing. We have the nation's first large-scale offshore wind project happening right now just off Cape Cod, an area where, of course, the Trump administration would love to drill, and thanks to General Frosch and others, we're working hard to fight that. Our work is about combating climate change, addressing the health and the well-being of our planet, protecting the safety and well-being of our residents, and also protecting our economy. This is about the future. This is about science. This is about facts. We collectively stand on the side of all of those. And in the face of efforts to take us backwards, to ruin the health and well-being of the planet, we will continue to see this administration in court as we need to take this on. I think we recognize the urgency of the moment, and we recognize the work that we need to do ahead, but I think you can see from the results of today's report just how far we've come in addressing many of these issues, and we'll continue to stay in the fight.
Great. Thank you, General Healy. It's my pleasure now to introduce Attorney General Tish James of New York, the newly elected Attorney General of a very, very important and groundbreaking Attorney General's office that has been a central player in protecting the environment for the residents of New York and for the nation. So please, we'd love to hear your remarks, General James.
Thank you, David, and I want to thank the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center of the NYU School of Law for having us here today. I come to this discussion based on personal experience. As a former city council member representing a low-income community, I had to bury 3 children who died from asthma attacks, who lived in public housing. As a result of that, I've dedicated my career to protecting natural resources, to protecting our air and our water and our land. As the city council member, as a public advocate, and now as the Attorney General of the state of New York. And also because of climate change, which is affecting all of us, I will not be a climate denier. I believe in facts and I believe in science. And it's an honor and a privilege to stand with my colleagues as attorney generals as we, again, sue the EPA to basically to do their job, as we stand up for those who are locked out of the sunshine of opportunity, as we stand up for those who will be disproportionately impacted by these changes in rules, as we represent our collective states, again, to protect our natural resources. We know that the vast majority of these changes are human-induced, And it's really critically important that we fight back and we represent the earth and the land and the water against these changes. This president of these United States, unfortunately, is changing these rules, and they're not based on any facts. They're not based on science. They're ill-conceived, and unfortunately, they will have a disparate impact. And so it's really critically important that we all stay together, because we all know that our earth is getting warmer, our waters are rising, and the air that we breathe, unfortunately, is getting more and more polluted. And the report focuses on the federal government's efforts to roll back 6 federal rules that are critical to public health and to the environment. And the rules that were implemented are dangerous to all of us. Dangers to children in particular. And again, changes will have an impact to communities all across this nation. And so I am proud that New York is leading a coalition of states and cities in opposing the EPA's proposed rollback of the Clean Power Plan. And this past October, we submitted comments in opposition to the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. And it is somewhat ironic and offensive that this administration would refer to it as the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, because there's nothing affordable about it, there's nothing clean about it, and it does not really reduce emissions at all. In fact, it will do nothing but surrender to climate change and surrender our government to those individuals who continue to pollute our air. And so we will not stand, we will not allow that to happen. We will fight back, and we will sue EPA at every chance that we get to ensure that they do their job and protect the air that we breathe and our water and our planet. And so I thank you, David, for all that you are doing, and I look forward to joining with you as we move forward.
Thank you. Thank you, General James. It's now my pleasure to introduce Attorney General of Connecticut, William Tong, newly elected in the fall, eager to make his mark in this arena as well.
Thank you, David, and thank you to NYU and the State Impact Center for hosting us and for leading all of us and this critical coalition. General Frosch mentioned that we have a group of true fighters here, and my 3 colleagues are really the finest examples of fighters on the front lines of this battle to save our planet and to protect our states. This is a coalition that isn't a loose-knit group of colleagues. We're constantly on the phone. Our staffs are constantly in touch. We have weekly phone calls, sometimes daily phone calls on these issues, and it's a real honor. I picked General Frosch as my mentor in my freshman season. And it's always great to be with my neighbor from the north, General Healy, and my neighbor to the south and the west, General James. I guess Connecticut's the meat and the sandwich between these 2 big states. Let me just say why I wanted to be here. I'm here because, like my colleagues, I come from a coastal state. I come from a state that is feeling firsthand the devastating and debilitating impacts of climate change, from Superstorm Sandy to drought in Connecticut, historic lows in our reservoirs, to the really unpredictable weather patterns that we now face. And something that I've come to learn, and it's true about some of us here, Connecticut is at the back of the tailpipe of America. And I say that because all the emissions upwind of us from Ohio and Pennsylvania and West Virginia blow through that tailpipe into Connecticut in the form of emissions that pollute our air and pollute our water, in addition to contributing to climate change, but cause real significant and very damaging adverse health impacts on the ground. And so that's why we're here. You mentioned that we're the first line of defense. We're also the last line of defense. And the first page of this report talks about a collaborative federalism model. And I think what that really means is this administration, the Trump administration, is not just not doing its part, it's dismantling a system of environmental protection that we've built up over generations here in this country. But we also know that it's very challenging for Congress to take action on climate change. And in that vacuum, it falls to the 50 sovereign states to join forces to reassert our power as a federal system joined together by our consent, right, to protect and defend our individual states and our residents. And that's why we're here, and it's a tremendous honor to be part of this coalition. Thank you.
Thank you. We're happy to take questions now. If you could introduce yourself. And also, I should say, there are questions available for those who are on the webinar. If I can find my notes. If you're out there listening in, you can tweet your questions to the State Impact Center's organizational Twitter account, which is at State Impact Center CNTR. So at State Impact Center CNTR, and those questions will be relayed up here. Juliet?
Thanks so much. Juliet Iofren with the Washington Post. Quick question. Obviously, a couple of you alluded to the fact that Democratic attorneys general have had success in challenging several of the energy and environmental rules that the Trump administration has put forward. Obviously, some of the players have changed within President Trump's cabinet, and you now have a couple folks heading these agencies who are more steeped in the law and the regulatory mechanisms than their predecessors. And I'm wondering, have you detected any change in the kinds of proposals that are coming forward? In other words, is it any harder looking forward in challenging some of these proposals, or is your sense that you will have just as great a track record going forward as you have in the past? Would be interested in your take on that.
Thanks for the question, Juliet. You know, I think that we have yet to see what has remained constant. Unfortunately, though, is the fact that agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency continue to be run and led by former operatives and executives from the fossil fuel industry. So it's no surprise that there was an effort early on to propose a rule that we all subsidize coal at the expense of renewable portfolios. It's not surprising that they made efforts to stop energy efficiency rules that were put in place, or rules around carbon emissions. We could go down the line. So I don't think we'll see the tactics change. And if something is wrong and wrong-headed and ill-conceived, we're going to continue to challenge those actions in court. Sometimes we've had success just by writing comment letters. You know, we've stopped any number of proposed rulemaking actions based on solidarity and show through comment letters, whether it's to FERC or to the EPA, that's resulted in a change of position. The other thing that I think is important to underscore here, this should not be a partisan issue. I talk about the economy and jobs. There are over 100,000 clean energy jobs in the state of Massachusetts. Over 100,000 clean energy jobs in the state of Massachusetts, a relatively small state. That's more clean energy jobs in one state than total coal jobs across the country. The future, the economic development and hope for this country has to rest on continued investments in the clean energy economy. And that's why, as members of the Northeast, we work, and up and down the seaboard, we're working to do things like support regional cap and trade investments, because we know these are good for our economy and sensible. We also know it's important to make the investments in electric vehicles, so many of us are working on things like that. So I think with more input, frankly, from the business community and from also some Republican governors stepping up and saying this needs to happen right now, this is good for our people and our economy, hopefully this becomes less of a discussion about partisanship and more a focus where it should be on facts and the future.
Could I also make a comment? You know, the first round that we faced was a round where the Trump administration was just not going to enforce the regulations and laws that were already in place. And we filed a number of different suits, and as far as I know, we haven't lost a single one in the area of energy, climate, and environment. The original leaders of the EPA and the Department of Interior were perhaps more eccentric than their successors. The new guys aren't riding their horses to work, as far as I know, and haven't engaged in repeated violations of the federal rules of ethics. But the work that they're doing is potentially even more destructive than that was done by Messrs. Zinke and Pruitt. And it has been done in a slapdash fashion. We think they've cobbled together the supposed support for these new regulations without really looking at the science that underlies them, without looking at the long record of their agencies. And we think they are equally vulnerable to attack, and we expect to challenge them, and I think we expect to continue to be successful in those challenges.
Can I just say this? The first round of cases that you were involved in were primarily based on violations of Administrative Procedure Act, as far as I know. 90% of those cases, they were successful at winning. Now that they've complied with the APA, it seems that right now the defense is primarily that the evidence, it's not evidence-based, it's based on a logic which is nonsensical, illogical, and not grounded in science. My other position is there is a false dichotomy, and the dichotomy is business versus the environment. And I reject that dichotomy. I believe that we can have a healthy economy and still defend and protect our natural resources. And it should not be a partisan issue. It should be an issue focused on the fact that we are all in this together, and that all of us right now are facing a very serious threat and risk.
Josh Siegel with the Washington Examiner. I'm wondering on the fuel efficiency rules specifically. I know it's easier for the California AG is here, but all your states, I believe, follow the California tougher standards. I'm wondering now that reports the Trump administration has cut off negotiations. I believe there was already like a preliminary lawsuit about the Trump administration's intent on that, but kind of, what do you see going forward if the Trump administration finalizes that proposal in the way that it originally proposed, and they do revoke or try to revoke California's waiver?
So I can take a crack at that. You're right, Josh. There's a lawsuit already underway, and there's a likely second lawsuit. The first lawsuit dealt with the initial decision of the administration to reopen what's called the mid-course review of the ongoing, fully agreed upon plan for continued more efficient fuel use to get our mileage standards up and gasoline consumption and emissions down. And the District of Columbia Circuit Court is now briefing that. So it's very possible that actually, before you even get to the rule, the District of Columbia Court will say that there was not a strong basis for concluding that the rule that has been in place and is supposed to go through 2026, there's no basis to reopen it. So that's number one, and that's in the courts, and these attorneys general are all on the papers in that regard. If the court says, well, we want to go and see the proposed rule, that's phase two. That's now teed up. The proposed rule came out last fall, as you know. Comments are in, and there's the proposal to freeze those standards at 2020, and also to revoke the California waiver under the Clean Air Act that enables California to have stricter standards. And under Section 177, these states all work with California on those stricter standards. That's going to be an issue around the adequacy of the record and the rationale that's being provided to stop, to freeze those standards. We don't have enough time to go into all of that. Let me just say that, consistent with what you're hearing today, the rationale we believe in that rulemaking is very weak. The notion that restricting, rather not continuing to improve gas mileage is going to result in more highway deaths is hard to understand.
I'll just say, if I may add to that, that the California waiver is very important to Maryland. Maryland has twice adopted California's vehicle emission standards. They are extremely important to us, keeping pollution down in our 3 non-attainment areas. And I expect, though I can't speak for General Becerra, I expect California to defend its right to adopt its own standards under the Clean Air Act, and Maryland will be there with them.
Hi, Ellen Gilmer from the Indian News. This is building on what Attorney General James was mentioning earlier about the early victories on administrative law issues. EPA's General Counsel said at a recent event that, administrative law has developed a lot in the past couple of years, and he thinks the Trump administration has been held perhaps to a higher standard in the courts. Do you have any response to that, or think there's any merit to it?
Well, I think fortunately the courts have been there to hold the Trump administration to standards. This is an administration that doesn't respect standards, high or low, to be frank. So, we're not going to litigate this through whatever a particular person at whatever agency had to say on a given day. We'll look at their actions. We'll continue to evaluate what we need to do to step up and defend the health and safety and well-being of our residents and of our states. It's as simple as that. And unfortunately, I think much of what you see coming out of the administration is not tethered to fact, science, not with a focus on the future, not with a care for what the infrastructure of this country demands and needs, or our place in the global economy. And so in the face of that, there will be the rest of us there to try to hold the line, and we'll just continue to do that. But that's exactly the problem with this administration. They have no conception of standards, and certainly I don't, have demonstrated a lack of an ability to adhere to any. When you talk about rolling back rules that keep toxic pesticides out of soil and food, right, or other rules that keep chemicals, where they're not supposed to be. I mean, the fact that we're even having to have these conversations and then put resources into keeping bad things from happening to people is really a shame. But it's where we've been at.
Yeah, I think to pick up on that, I don't think this is really about standards. I think that's misdirection. This isn't a nice conversation to have about technical arguments. And as you said, these aren't technical discussions about science. They're not enforcing basic rules like the good neighbor rule, which prevents upwind states from polluting to downwind states like ours. And to pick up on what Juliet said earlier, it really doesn't matter much if you change the players and they have marginally more expertise in one area or another, when their basic motivating goal and philosophy is to dismantle a modern regulatory regime that keeps our families healthy and safe. And that's foundational. That's not technical. That's not about in-the-weeds standards. That's about fundamentally altering our way of life.
Higher standards, fake news. I mean, there's certain thresholds that one has to meet in law. And this administration, unfortunately doesn't believe that they should follow the law or honor the law or respect the rule of law. And so I reject the argument that, in fact, they're being held to a higher standard. There's certain thresholds in the law, and they must be made. And when you fail to meet them, it's just a question of fact. whether or not one has met them. And clearly, in most of the cases, they did not meet those thresholds, and those cases were dismissed, and they were done based on the law.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, all. Thanks for holding this press conference. I'm Abby Smith with Bloomberg Environment. You all have mentioned when talking about these rollbacks that they're not grounded in science. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how do you anticipate using climate science, something like the National Climate Assessment that we've seen from 13 federal agencies, in your legal fight? The courts typically tend to give discretion to agencies like EPA on scientific matters. But do you have a sense that maybe they won't do that in this case? And how do you expect to bring science into your arguments? Thanks.
Well, the irony here is that the policies that are being put in place, especially at EPA, fly in the face of the United States government's findings, and they've got to underpin their rules with something that's fact-based. And if they can't do it from the scientific studies that have been commissioned and delivered on behalf of the United States government, they're going to have a very difficult time, I think, showing that they have a reasonable basis for the regulations they're putting in place.
Okay, that's our press conference. Thank you very much for attending, and thanks. Let's give a hand to the Attorney Generals. Thank you.